You know that wonderful feeling you get when you pick up a novel and find yourself hooked from page one? You can't stop turning pages. You can't put it down and you stay up late to finish it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could somehow bottle that magic and put it in your own writing? Well, I think you can, and in this video I want to show you what I think it is, what this magic consists of, and show you how you can add it to your own writing. And to demonstrate it, my technique, I'm going to take an old postcard I sent back from the Philippines to my mum when I was backpacking many years ago, and I'm going to turn it into the plot, the contents into the plot of a movie, which will be called The Most Beautiful Girl Who Ever Robbed Me. So welcome to another installment in my series on how to write your novel using that most unlikely of writing implements, a round Oxford bus ticket. For inspiration, we're taking the bus down to the High Street, to this place, Merton College, because in 1914 the poet T.S. Eliot was a scholar here for a short while, and one of his more famous poems is The Hollow Men, which begins with the epigraph, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, which is taken from Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And Mr. Kurtz, that crazy, ghostly figure in the jungle, will be the centre point of my story about the girl who robbed me. So let's take a look at that postcard. Dear Mum, I'm in the Philippines. Met a girl in Manila who invited me to stay with her family for Easter. That was interesting. It rained the whole time. Back to Bangkok on Monday. Not exactly a page-turner, is it? So let's turn it into one. So what then is this magic that glues us to the page? Well, I think that when we begin a story, an unvoiced question arises in our heart, which says, why should I care? Why does this matter to me? And the skillful storyteller evokes this question but doesn't answer it directly. Instead, he imbues the text with hints and whispered promises that point to the resolution. And it almost always has something to do with deep eternal truths about the human condition, about psychological or spiritual transformation. Well, that might sound a bit highfalutin, but really, what is Cinderella if not such a parable? A story of transformation, a rags-to-riches archetype. And all great stories rest on these mythic structures. Perhaps the most famous is the hero's journey paradigm, discovered or identified by mythologist Joseph Campbell. A hero leaves the ordinary world, sets off on a quest, encounters trials and difficulties, is changed psychologically and returns with the Grail or the elixir or whatever it was he sought. Well, that's Star Wars. And Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, well, that's a Grail quest. And Travis Dale, the character played by Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, is really a dark vision of Orpheus descending into the underworld. I'll put some links below to some books about these mythic structures. In movies, they call this the through line. And the through line doesn't tell us what the story is about. It tells us what it's really about. And to see what I mean, let's look at The Godfather. Now, Al Pacino plays Michael Corleone, the youngest member of the crime syndicate, the crime family, but he's moral and idealistic and doesn't want anything to do with his family's criminal activities.
That's my family, kid. It's not me.
But then his father gets gunned down, and he finds himself drawn inexorably against his will, reluctantly, bit by bit, into the darkness, doesn't he? And he starts making choices which erode his moral being, erode his soul, until eventually he becomes the opposite of what he started as. He becomes the man he originally despised. His hands are steeped in blood. He's Macbeth. And the through line? A good man becomes a bad man. Every scene in the movie hangs from this invisible thread. The through line gives the story unity and momentum and meaning, and usually traces some sort of journey, but not across mountains or oceans, but across the landscape of the heart. So let's give a through line to my postcard from the Philippines. Now, I don't want to start this story at the beginning. I'm going to begin at the end with me as an old man rediscovering the card and reflecting. And here his words, he says, Before I went to the Philippines, I had no idea about the place apart from the fact that Francis Ford Coppola shot Apocalypse Now there. And Apocalypse Now, as we know, is based on Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And I realise now, looking back, that just as Conrad's narrator went up the Congo River into the dark heart of Africa, I too made a similar journey up the Ulot River into the darkness of Samar. And I did not discover, as did Conrad's narrator, the darkness in man's heart, but I discovered something even more unsettling, perhaps. I discovered that I was a fool. Well, a pretty good setup, don't you think? I travelled up the Ulot River into the darkness and slew my dragon and returned with a grail of terrifying self-knowledge. I bet you don't do that on holiday. So, and what was the monster I slew? The rhinoceros beetle, the most terrifying beast ever to be found on this planet. I saw one once in the Natural History Museum in London, and I thought, if I ever see one of those in the Philippines, I'm getting straight back on the plane. So let's see how the story unfolds. I met the girl, we'll call her Mahal, at a floating bar in the bay off Puerto Galera. And the other girls there warned me against her. They told me she was a hunting girl, which was a phrase in those days used to indicate someone who was a freelancer. But she didn't strike me as one. We chatted and had a few beers, and then she left. And then later, when I went to pay for the tab, the barman told me that she'd already paid it. And a few days later, I met her again, and we became a couple, travelling up country in a series of really dirt-cheap hotels. And at the time, I didn't have much money. I had no credit card or traveller's checks, just some cash and an emergency $100 bill zipped up in the back of my wallet. And every morning, when she went to the comfort room at the end of the corridor, I, with a sense of mild shame, would count my money to see if it was still there. Well, eventually she invited me to stay with her family for the Easter fiesta in her province, and so we began a journey encompassing buses and coaches and jeepneys and ships, and eventually a sampan upriver in the Ulot River. And there was an old lady in this little boat, and she saw me and began to argue with Mahal. And it was clear to me that they were arguing about me. And after a while, the old lady turned to me and said, "Americano, sir, it's no good you go to Las Navas." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Too dangerous." I said, "Dangerous? How?" And she did this, she go, pew, 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 pew. Well, it turned out that Mahal lived in a part of the Philippines controlled by the New People's Army, which is a communist Maoist insurgent group, and the Lonely Planet Guide told you not to go anywhere near it. But obviously her family had not read the Lonely Planet Guide. I'd never really wondered where they lived, but it turned out, when we finally got there, that they lived in the Stone Age. The village was a load of huts made from orange box slats, without no glass in the window, no running water, no electricity. I looked around and panicked because I realised how far we were from a hospital, and I said, "We can't stay here. Mahal, we have to go back." And she looked at me and said, "You Sarah Ulu! You Sarah Ulu!" Well, Sarah Ulu, which needs no translation, is a phrase you hear a lot when you're travelling in the Philippines. Well, I did at least. But then the weather changed everything, or put paid to any plans of return, because the heavens opened and the rains fell, and it was impossible to travel for the next week. So we settled into the life. We slept on the wooden floor and ate rice with biscuits made from dried river fish. And every morning we'd go to the river to bathe and be watched by about 100 children lining the bank. And people heard about me for miles, and they came from all over the province to see me. And they carried chairs, which they set up outside the hut and sat down and stared at the Americano through the window all day. And sometimes they would talk to me, and they'd always refer to Mahal as my wife. And I'd correct them. But the looks of utter astonished bafflement which came over their countenance when I did this made me eventually stop. And when I did correct them, I could sense the shame radiating off Mahal. And that's when the scales began to fall from my eyes, because I realised that for me this was just a big adventure, something I would tell the lads in the pub about when I got home. But for Mahal, a girl destined almost inevitably to a life of grinding, debilitating poverty? Well, it was something quite different entirely for her, wasn't it? Sometimes in the evenings the rains would abate, and we would go outside and procure some homemade rum and sit beneath the stars, and the fireflies flickered round the trees like Christmas tree lights. And she would tell me the story of her life, how when the soldiers beat her brother in the marketplace, she ran away to Manila and met a jeepney driver who made her pregnant and then vanished. And she showed me the tattered Kodak photo of the baby's funeral, a coffin the size of a shoebox resting in a field where the grass was like green fire. And then one evening the soldiers came for me, and the leader challenged me to a duel. And I'll tell you about that after this short commercial break. They call it Soku Shinbutsu. It's an extreme 11th century Buddhist practice in which a monk would mummify himself while still alive. It's not hard to do. You just spend years eating nothing but resin, pine needles, and tree bark, which acts as a preservative. And to avoid the problem of corpse flies being attracted to you, you just drink the sap of the Japanese varnish tree, which acts as a natural insect repellent. Oh, for Pete's sake, if you want to preserve yourself for posterity, don't drink creosote. Write a novel. Get Gateway to Narnia, your free 10-part email course on how to write your novel. Gateway to Narnia. The link is in the description below. What happened next will always remain a mystery to me. The duel did not consist of a conventional one with pistols, but with rum. The captain bid me sit at the kitchen table. He put down a bottle of rum and 2 tumblers, and he filled them both. And he took the tumbler and he knocked it back in one. So I took mine and knocked it back in one. And he refilled them, and he took his and knocked it back in one. And I took mine and knocked it back in one. And this went on all evening. And the following morning around 5 a.m. I woke up under the table, and Mahal's brothers were prodding me, saying, "Americano, we must leave." And so we set off and marched into the dawn. And by noon we arrived at a real town with concrete buildings and a cafe selling cold beer. And so we went there. And then word spread that there was an Americano in the cafe, so all the girls came to chat. And Mahal's mood darkened a bit here. I could sense she wasn't comfortable, or she wouldn't say anything. And the girls asked me whether I had any male friends or brothers back home who would like to be pen friends with Filipino girls. And I said I could ask. So they wrote down their names and addresses on a scrap of paper and handed it to me. And I took it with all due solemnity as if it was a religious icon and put it in the back of my wallet next to the $100 bill. And then a boy arrived with a pet rhinoceros beetle on a string, and he threw it at me, and I caught it and kissed it. And then a week later I was back in Bangkok, and I remembered the scrap of paper, so I opened my wallet, and the $100 bill was still there, but the scrap of paper was gone. It was the only thing she ever stole from me. Well, I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to learn a writing secret I stole from the Lone Ranger, take a look at the video that should be on screen now.